Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next module. This comes after our discussion, our deep discussion about visioning in terms of leadership. Again, part of the momentum framework. Actually, I'll switch over to the doc cam so you can share the drawings that I redid for you because I was a little embarrassed by the drawings from the last lecture. So I redid a few. I put them into the deck that I uploaded to Blackboard. But we talked a lot about vision. We went deep on understanding the people and the problems that we solve for them. We're going to, in a later lecture, go even deeper on how we're going to measure trust, how we would measure loyalty, how we would measure relationships in general, which is always through human behavior. Like how could we measure the behaviors of the people in the ecosystem that we're leading as a core function of our leadership. And this is the thing I think great leaders do that I've seen in the wild is that they have a natural ability to do this. They see when things are working, and when things are not working, they work to resolve that. And we talked about how vision, motivation, this combination of things is really strategy. And when we have a good strategy, we see relationships being built in both our customer ecosystems and our employee ecosystems and our vendor ecosystems, if those are important to the firm as well. So if I could, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go to the deck. Again, this should look familiar to you. We talked a lot about strategy being this combination of vision and motivation. You know, just like Sun Tzu said, if you know where you're going as the leader, but the people that you're leading aren't signed up to get after it, where are you really going? And we did go deep on motivation in the lecture as well. So I consider strategy to be this combination of a clear, comprehensive, shared vision, accompanied by a team with the motivation to achieve it. Like if you're leading something and you're the only one that's actually doing the work, that's not really leadership. Leadership is about creating the environment that inspires other people into action, ultimately for a cause of some sort, so for a meaningful result. I like to use the analogy of relationships. Trust, loyalty, and advocacy is my metaphor for that, but really what we're talking about is the building of authentic relationships between the organization and the people that it leads. And vision, we broke it down into the 3 component parts, making sure we understand who it is that we're serving, what problems we're solving for them. Remember, we did the Hoshin Star exercise and we worked out a way to prioritize the problems that we're solving. We talked about first order problems, second order problems, those being of the higher order human needs that we might meet through our products and services from our company. And then having motivating metrics and having metrics that show people that demonstrate and create conversations that occur in the hallways when you're not in the room as the leader around what success looks like, what success feels like. And we went deep on understanding how to prioritize, like what does this look like? It's hard to do, but the better job we do of articulating what the dominance hierarchies in our customer ecosystems and in our employee ecosystems look like, the more powerful we can lead, the clearer it is why we're making decisions. And then if we stack rank the problems that we're solving for those people as well, we get to this point where we understand what our core advocacy position looks like. That's what I call the core advocacy position. This clear, crisp understanding of who we're serving and what problems we're solving. We build persona sets for these folks that include definitions of how we're going to solve these problems in clear language. We have opportunities are always going to arise that are going to question our leadership. Like, which decisions do we make? These are key leadership decisions here. Do we expand our products and services or do we expand our market? And figuring that out is a key leadership decision. We're always going to be tempted because there's money associated with both of those decisions, but we want to maintain focus, downward pressure. Okay. And we're going to have to expand at some point, but the key leadership thing here is that expansion should be careful. This is a key leadership decision because you're deploying resources to do this. And we don't want to distract from our mission, which is to actually create advocates from the people that we serve through the problems that we solve for them. All right. Once we've identified those core advocates, This is what vision is about. I did not do this graph with you guys, so let me do that real quick. So this concept here of when you have clarity, so if you drew a graph of the clarity that you have about around the people that you're serving and the clarity that you have around the problems that you're solving, like a shared understanding, shared clarity amongst your team. Again, leadership's not about your understanding, it's about your ability to articulate it and to share it and to get other people to share it. Like the bigger your organization is, the more important it is to have a very clear understanding of who in the world we are here to serve and what problems we are solving for them. And when you do that well, when you have clarity, your people see the path. It's easier for them to build these relationships. This is how you'll know that you're being successful. Again, trust, loyalty, advocacy is a proxy for a relationship. You could do this in lots of different ways. This is a clean way that I've learned to do it because it's easy to replicate. And when you don't have that, you get downward movement. And this is what I would call confusion, like a lack of clarity in terms of who we're serving, what problems we're solving, or how we're going to measure success. This is that symptom. If you remember from a couple lectures ago, I gave you that diagnostic framework that shows, hey, when the vision's weak, it doesn't manifest as momentum, it manifests as confusion. And this is sort of mathematically what that would look like on a graph. All right. Super interesting. Okay. So coming back to the doc cam, we are again in this vision space. We also talked a little bit about motivation. I redrew this. And I also drew this in a different way in class, if you remember. I wanted to show that culture is the context, the language, the words, the lexicon, the mantras, the stories and the lore. It's the glue that helps us take our strategy and make sure it's represented in our execution. Because all of these things, all these decisions that are made through conversations that occur between executives and between executives and their leaders and followers. It's conversations that occur between people. And all of those conversations, basically, that's where your culture lives, if you remember. So it's in these conversations. If we don't have clarity around our vision and language around our vision, the people we serve, the problems we solve, and the team's not motivated by that, it's hard for us to actually get powerful traction in the execution of the things that we're doing. That's why empathy is so important. Communication is so important in leadership. It's like the critical soft skill is our ability to clearly communicate. And if you haven't figured this out, like the tools I'm giving you are tools that have worked for me and that I've seen work in very successful leadership situations. They're patterns that I see and tools to help you communicate better, like articulating your vision, articulating and understanding the people that you serve and the problems that you solve in a way that you can share with others why these things are important is a way to articulate and to build a culture around the problems that you solve and the people that you serve. It's like a way to build, it's a structural way to figure out what your positioning looks like. This is who we are and who we're going to be. And then when you change that, this is a tool, this tool here is a tool for you to help you figure out how to pivot. Like, should we be solving these other problems, or should we be taking these key problems that we solve and target another market? Like if there's a structural shift in the market, let's say there's a pandemic and these customers, these customers over here are not going to be with us in a few months. We have to either figure out, can we solve other problems for them that will help them stay in business? We can get closer, or should we be looking at other markets to target so that we don't die along with them, when there's a structural shift in the market conditions? And those are going to happen. They're going to happen throughout the course of any business. This is kind of the way it works. All right. From there, we went into DISC. We talked about DISC profiling, and I want to go a little deeper on that. I want to give you some of the science behind it because we had sort of a high level conversation about DISC. Put it up behind me here. So if you remember, there's these four possible quadrants here, D being the drivers, I being the influencers, S being the supporters, C being the compliance. And I told you it was wrong. It's just a framework, and there's lots of them. Well, I do I do want us to dig into the science a little bit so you guys understand that there is science behind personality types. There's some deep social science. Like there's a lot of people working on this stuff. So let me go to the doc cam and I'll just draw out what I know about that. And we can have a conversation about the Big Five. They call it the Big Five. There's two acronyms that they use in the Big Five when they talk about Big Five personality traits. And they say, they say that each trait obviously is on a continuum and individuals fall anywhere in between. If you remember when we did DISC, I just used two traits. I used like extroversion, introversion, people-oriented, data-oriented. This is the thing that's been done for years in the business community. But each one's it's a spectrum. Like you can be very low on the extroversion scale, very high on the extroversion scale. But it's a spectrum is the point for each of the traits. The Big Five these are the Big Five that have been shown to be relatively stable throughout most people's lifetimes. Not everyone. There's always examples of people that don't fit that mold, but for the most part, they remain stable throughout your life. You have these traits. This is what they are. Once you reach, I think, adulthood, somewhere around 24, 25 years old, they're relatively fixed. A lot of ability to influence them before that. They also say that they're significantly influenced by genes. I think the number I've heard is about 50% is heritable, but I don't know how good that science is or how much it's been validated. And there's also some evidence that point to outcomes in life, like happiness, education, health associated with some of them. All right, so the Big Five factor model associated with the Big Five personality styles, personality factors, all of which were all on every one of these scales somewhere. The first one is called conscientiousness. The next one's called agreeableness. The next one's called neuroticism. The next one's openness. And the next one's extroversion. And again, they're all on a scale. So, and if you think about, and they use, I think it's ocean or canoe. Canoe are the two acronyms, so you can remember them. Canoe or ocean. Makes it a little more memorable. The Big Five personality traits. All right, so these are real. These are scientifically backed. There's all sorts of evidence. What they did was they did a study and they used a bunch of word association to figure out like where people are. And across these studies, they figured out these are sort of the 5 ways people describe themselves in terms of, let me see if I can clean up that video a little bit. There you go. In terms of words and language and how we use it. So on conscientiousness, the scale looks like this. It's impulsive or disorganized to highly disciplined and careful. Disciplined or careful. So impulsive / disorganized to disciplined and careful. All right. Agreeableness, and this is the scale for conscientiousness, and we're all on that scale somewhere. Agreeableness goes from uncooperative and suspicious, I think is the other word, uncooperative, to trusting and helpful. Uncooperative to trusting and helpful. Again, a scale. Neuroticism, calm and confident, to anxious. Anxious and pessimistic. Now these are, again, natural styles. Like I said, even with DISC, they're natural styles, but even with DISC, they're context dependent. So you'll change where you are on each of these scales depending on the situation you're in, the people you're with, the scenario, your day, how your day is going, like what your last day, week, month has been like. You will change these things. On the openness scale, it's over here. It's people who prefer routine, like rule followers, prefer routines, or are very practical, to imaginative, spontaneous, open to experience, basically. Openness to experience, imaginative, and spontaneous. And you can also see that there isn't good or bad, because in different scenarios, it's good to be more practical than it is to be spontaneous. And it's good to be uncooperative in certain scenarios than it is to be trusting. It's very context dependent. I think this is the important thing to note, is that all of these big five, from conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, there's a time for everything. And knowing when to pull those out, this is a key leadership tool. And knowing how to recognize these traits in others is a key leadership tool as well. And there's various tools, online tools, that you can take and get free. You can actually do the big five for free too. I believe there's a couple sites out there that'll allow you to do that. And you can figure out what are your personality traits, your normal, like natural personality traits in that context. All right, so extroversion. This one I think is a little more obvious. We know about this. Reserved and thoughtful versus sociable and fun-loving. Sociable and fun-loving. I thought it was fun in the class when I asked you guys on the DISC scale where to put me, and you all pretty much jumped right on the I quadrant. Like I said, I use DISC, but this one is scientifically backed. But again, I don't think any of them is perfect or right, because they're so context heavy, it's so context dependent that you can't say definitively, this is what people are going to be. And if you wanted to go deeper on it and you want to use a scientific construct, my recommendation is that you use this one, the ocean model versus DISC. But DISC I like because DISC really takes a couple of these and kind of combines them. So like, openness and extroversion are on one scale, and sort of conscientiousness and agreeableness are on another scale. And you can quickly use it as a way. Let's jump back to the PowerPoint here. You can quickly use it as a way to teach, and because DISC is so simple, it's easy to teach. And if you can teach it and learn it, it will help the people in your leadership ecosystem to be more empathetic. It'll increase the empathy that you have for your customers, and it will also increase people's empathy for each other. Because if you teach people the importance of understanding the desires and likes and wants and the way people consume information more purposely, you will get a better result. So here's how I do it. Again, you can use a different model besides DISC. I think people who exhibit extroversion and data orientation are typically people who make snap decisions. They're the take the hill kind of leaders. They're often low empathy. Again, none of these things is definitive, but this has been my experience. They're lower empathy. They're more concerned with results than they are with how the results make people feel, as an example. So you'll often, like I said, see a lot of CEOs in the D role. You'll see a lot of, hard driving, results-oriented professionals in the D role. And again, there's nothing wrong with any one of these. And one of the important things I also found, remember we went through the persona, we talked about how we use personas in my company. But the cool thing about it is when you understand it, you can actually look for balance. I think all of the four roles add value to a firm or to an organization or to a team. Like if one of these roles is missing from a team, you often see dysfunctions. So the influencers, these are folks they make decisions on their gut. They care a little bit more about how people feel than what the results show. They tend to be a little more visionary. They tend to be idea people. They also tend to be very distracted, like shiny object syndrome. You know, these are the folks that you see falling into that sort of category. The next one is the S's. These are supportives. Decision by committee. These are your raw leaders, but they're going to get consensus from everybody. They're not going to make a decision until they've got everybody's opinion included and evaluated, and they're sort of slow and steady wins the race sort of folks. Definitely very people-oriented. This is how they operate. And then on the C side, these are your compliance, your rule followers. They make decisions with data. If you back them into a corner, they're going to snap at you, but they're logical, they're analytical. You get your best results from these folks when you give them a lot of data, and you give them time to consume it before they make a decision. You often find a lot of programmers and coders and accountants and CPAs, detail people, highly detail-oriented people tend to fall into this realm. So detail orientation is definitely on the bottom of the DISC scale, whereas visioning, creative stuff is often on the top. Again, like I said, one of the things I found is that if you have a team of people and it's a large enough team, it's valuable to have all of these perspectives to balance it out when you're leading. So you get different perspectives. I don't think having a team of all eyes isn't going to get much done. They're going to be dreaming and talking about it, but they're not actually going to execute on much. Having a team of all C's is going to get you a ton of predictability and analysis, but it may not get you any possibility. It may not get you super creative results. So having a balance here, none of these is bad. I think they play off of each other really well when you get them into a room together. The key, again, is to having shared goals that all of the people in the room are signed up for. Having shared goals that are that people are motivated by. Okay. So the other thing we talked briefly about was this concept of problems. So we went deep on the problems. We did the Hoshin star to try to figure out, hey, these are the problems that they came to you to solve. You remember this chart? And we talked about second order problems, and then we put them on this map. And we talked about our capacity for caring, making sure we understand the higher level needs of our consumers over time, because these are, I drew it above the line, below the line here, but it's not really like that. It's more like they're very intertwined. It's not that even in the examples that we did the cascade of concerns for our case study here. We chose a persona that we labeled Ruth, if you guys remember. These are intertwined, and they're both, there's combinations here if you think about of first order and second order problems. But we need to understand them if we're going to help our teams and our people make good decisions around how to expend the resources in our that are under our control. All right. So back to the deck. I put a couple of extra slides in here for you guys, and I shared this on the lecture. I shared the slides on the lecture as well, up on Blackboard. Sorry. But I want to talk about here. So it's not really definitive where it's above and below this line. It's really in order, as you move out in time and build a relationship with your consumers or your employees or your customers, you're solving problems for them, or they wouldn't be coming to you. And the higher order problems are always the ones, that are involved in, the intrinsic motivation, which we did talk about. Intrinsic motivation, we talked a little bit about the flip from I to we. And in terms of teams, we know our teams are motivated when we've achieved a state of alignment on a shared set of meaningful goals. We are confident in each other's skills, talents, and our own personal contributions. And we are committed to the result. And we see that through action. And we can measure it we can measure these things. There's a couple of tools out there. Self-determinationtheory.org is a great resource for all sorts of information, research, things organizations are doing across the board in all sorts of domains, business domain, education domain. There's instruments available that will help you figure out like, hey, how could I survey periodically my people to determine whether or not we have motivation on our team. So there's survey instruments. You know how I feel about surveys. We talked about that a little bit, but when you have a group of advocates, they'll be eager to know how their peers are doing, and they'll be eager to understand the motivation of themselves. So we use a third-party tool. It's from a company that's actually owned by Ed Deci and Richard Ryan. These are the fathers of self-determination theory. And we do periodically survey our teams to try to get an understanding of their level of alignment, confidence, and commitment. Again, measured individually by relatedness, competence, and their sense of autonomy, which we're going to do a whole lecture on autonomy and psychological safety. So I think these are important leadership skills to understand. Okay, next we're going to go a little deeper on motivation. We're going to talk about self-determination theory in depth. Self-determination theory. Again, because I believe that motivation is our key strategic input. And having a motivated team means we have to understand motivation in order to get them motivated. And you're gonna see kind of how it unfolds in terms of the momentum framework, like why having a clear vision is essential, and having goals that matter, goals that people actually care about, is essential to great leadership. So there's 6 sub-theories involved in self-determination theory, 6 sub-theories. The 6 sub-theories are commonly described as the basic needs theory. And this is essentially everything Maslow had to say, that we have some basic psychological needs. And if they're not met, so meeting these psychological needs are what cause us to be motivated. There's extrinsic and intrinsic needs. It specifies the relation to intrinsic motivation, though, in the context of self-determination theory. So high quality engagement, effective functioning, and psychological well-being. But in this context, I think of like the way in which Maslow described it. We have psychological needs, and when they're met, we get motivation from that. All right. The second one is organismic integration theory. This one's really important. This talks about the scale between going from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, kind of like I've been drawing for you guys, like motivation exists on a scale. This theory introduces types of extrinsic motivation. It specifies basically the antecedents, the characteristics, the consequences of each of the different types of motivation. It explains like successful versus unsuccessful socialization as an example. It's deep, so we're going to talk. This is the deep one, and this is the conversion, basically, the integration of needs in the context of self-determination theory. It's the integration of needs, the conversion from extrinsic to intrinsic. So it's extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, and how they believe that works. Intrinsic. That's the organismic integration theory. The next one is the goal contents theory. And this one basically says that goals matter. The goal contents theory. That there's a hierarchy to goals. There's goals that matter. It distinguishes intrinsic goals from extrinsic goals to explain how the former supports psychological needs and well-being, whereas the latter neglects these needs and fosters ill-being. Extrinsic basically neglects intrinsic needs and fosters ill-being. Intrinsic makes sure that we understand the intrinsic needs, those of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And we've talked a lot about this, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. That's where this one comes from. And that the goals actually matter. The goals you set and the language that you use matter. And that's the next part, cognitive evaluation theory. Cognitive evaluation theory. And this theory predicts the effect that any external event will have on intrinsic motivation. Basically, what this thing's saying is that there are external events that support autonomy, competence, and intrinsic motivation, while other events interfere with and thwart those motivations. And essentially, the way I read this, we've talked a lot about this in our class, is that the context matters. Like the events that have led up to this moment in time when you're experiencing the motivation or not, and how you're experiencing it. This to me, this theory explains pretty clearly why language and the environment that you create are important, and they matter. The context matters. All right. The next one is causality orientations theory. You could do a whole course on each of these mini sub-theories. I call them mini theories or sub-theories. Causality, orientations theory. And by the way, they usually refer to them as like the BNT, the OIT, the GCT, the CET. Notice they're all 3 words, and the COT. Causality, orientations theory. This one identifies individual differences in how students or how people in general motivate and engage themselves. To engage themselves, some people rely on autonomous guides, while others rely on controlling environmental guides. Some people actually thrive in a more structured environment. I'm going to talk about that when I talk about psychological safety. The key here with this theory is that all people are different. People are different, and they value needs on different scales in different ways. People are different. So we have to recognize and understand that not everybody's going to be motivated by the same things in the same exact percentages, so to speak. Like some people value autonomy more than relatedness. And again, the context matters. So it's complicated. So if we think about this from a leadership perspective, the more people you lead, the more complicated all of this stuff is. It's not so easy to motivate people, but the more of an understanding you have, the more you can generalize and make better general decisions, across the board, right? So now we're going to go deeper on this theory, this organismic integration theory. Okay, so the organismic integration theory, we're going to break it down. Basically, it says self-determination exists theory. The motivation exists on a continuum, like I've been telling you guys all along. There's a continuum of motivation from non-self-determined to self-determined at the far left of the scale. You have this concept, I'll write it this way. So non-self-determined all the way to completely entirely self-determined. Right, and so they draw it in a chart. I've seen it drawn this way, like motivation. The regulatory styles, the reg styles, the source, what's the source of the motivation, internal or external on a scale, and then what regulates, what is it that actually regulates the motivation? What's causing it to occur? And again, on the left side, you have this concept of, kind of like a chart. Here, you have this concept of amotivation, which is entirely possible. People are not motivated by this goal that you have. When we think about goals, and again, goals matter because of the goal evaluation theory that we talked about a few minutes ago. The regulatory style or the regulation style here is that there is no it's non-regulatory. Non-regulation occurs. It's like, think of it as like indifference. It's impersonal. So the source is impersonal. It's completely external. Okay. It's completely external and not even personal. And the regulation, what regulates it is non-intentional, incompetence, non-valuing, lack of control, incompetence. And the feeling of a lack of control. Like the opposite of having control. So if you feel like you're out of control or being controlled. All right, so, and then you have a bunch on the external or the extrinsic motivations. So extrinsic motivation. And you have four different things on the scale of extrinsic motivation. There's, and they're all types of regulation. So you have external regulation, introjected, identified, and integrated. Okay, and then at the far end here, this is where we have our intrinsic motivation, the highest quality possible form of motivation. And this is where it's internally and intrinsically regulated. Okay, so obviously, external regulation for extrinsic motivation, it's an external source. It's not myself, it's other. It's another person or another entity that's driving the motivation. And in this case, it's regulated by compliance. I think of like fear, or like I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to have a reduction in pay, or I'm not going to get this reward, right? So compliance or external rewards and punishments. So carrots and sticks. Think carrots and sticks. Okay, these are the externals. All right. Under integrated, next level up, they call this somewhat external. The source of the motivation is somewhat external. And again, it's a scale. So you have somewhat external, then it goes to somewhat internal. And then you can have an internal integrated extrinsic motivator that you've internally integrated, still not be intrinsic, and that's the difference here. When it's internal and intrinsic, these are the types of things that you do because you're authentically interested. Think play, right? Just purely for enjoyment. And a lot of forms of learning for leaders, you know, and inherent, like this inherently satisfies you, inherent satisfaction. And this is the ultimate form of motivation, when you're doing things simply for the sake of enjoyment and because you actually enjoy and are interested in the thing and the learning and whatever it is that you're doing. When you're in these lower modes, you get, so the source is different and the regulation is different. So, you know, here, once it's introjected, sorry for it's a little hard to read here, somewhat external source, you know, this is where they start to think about like self-control, involvement. So they feel involved, but maybe still don't feel like they have much control, but they feel at least involved and included. Maybe you're starting to see some internal rewards like pride start to show up, and internal punishments like shame, like I feel guilty for not doing this in the context of this extrinsic motivation. So there may be some internalized punishments here. All right, and then somewhat internal identified regulation. This is, you associate this with some kind of personal importance. And you consciously, so there's a conscious valuation. So you're like, oh, yeah, this is a little bit important to me. So some conscious valuing of the motivation, okay? And then integrated internal, this is where you have what they call congruence. You're doing it, you see why it's being done. You have some sense of awareness of the motivation, like of this external source of the motivation. So it's still an external source. I'm sorry, it's an internal, you've converted it from an external source to an internal source. Like now you're going to do this thing even though it's still an extrinsic motivator, like money, because you've come up with a cause or a use for the money that's beyond just the earning of the dollars, like the metric itself. And you've formed some sort of synthesis with self. Synthesis with self. And again, the ultimate form of motivation is intrinsic. When you've internalized it, you're doing it for the pure enjoyment, inherent satisfaction. And this is when you're firing on all of those 4 cylinders. I feel like I'm in control. I'm growing and learning. I'm connected to this human-oriented purpose. I've got a purpose, relatedness, competence, learning and growing, mastery, and autonomy. Like I have a steering wheel. Okay, so that's the breakdown of self-determination theory. It's all in the book. There's a lot of science behind it. There's lots and lots of research that's been done that supports sort of this range. Again, this is somewhat of a fuzzy range, but it makes sense that it's on a range. And I think that's the key thing to remember. And that the goal is to move the motivators from extrinsic to intrinsic. And the way in which you do that is through context, language, goals, and guardrails. Thank you.